Stories of sudden and mysterious disappearances are not uncommon, and according to the familiar pattern, a perfectly ordinary human being drops out of sight, leaving not a single trace behind. And this is the pattern followed in the strange case of the two missing airmen, with one important exception. They did leave traces behind, clear and unmistakable traces, which led exactly nowhere.
On July 24th, 1924, at 9 o'clock in the morning, two officers, Lieutenant W.T. Day and Pilot Officer D.R. Stewart, took off from the British aerodrome near Tehran on a routine reconnaissance mission. They were scheduled to return not later than noon. But noon came, 1 o'clock and 2, and still they did not appear. Back at the aerodrome, two of their fellow officers, Captain Bellows and Lieutenant Fielding, scanned the sky impatiently.
I don't like it, Fielding. What could possibly have happened to them? Engine trouble, most likely. Or perhaps they ran out of petrol. They'd been forced down somewhere in the desert.
And so the two men set out in search of their missing comrades. They flew low over the desert. And for a half hour or more, they saw nothing beneath them but vast, billowing waves of sand. And then Lieutenant Fielding tugged sharply at the captain's arm. A half-mile distant, silent and motionless and alone, squatted the missing plane. The other plane swooped swiftly down toward it, then came taxiing up to its side.
Day! Stewart! Where are you men?
But there was no answer to their calls. Shielding their eyes from the sun, they turned slowly, scanning the desert on all sides of them.
What could have happened to them, sir? They couldn't have gone far enough to be out of sight. Perhaps if we knew what brought them down, sir.
Good idea. Look in the tank.
It's half full, sir.
Captain Bellows climbed into the cockpit, and the lieutenant spun the propeller.
There's nothing the matter with that engine, sir. I'm sure they could have got back if they'd tried.
I've heard of a lot of strange things, but I've never heard of anything that plucks planes out of the sky. At least not filled.
Captain, look.
Footprints.
2 pairs of them. And they're not ours, sir.
Like bloodhounds who have found the scent, the two men followed the trail of footprints across the sand. For 40 yards they walked, their hearts pounding with excitement. And then?
The prints. Where are they?
They stopped dead right here. Day and Stewart walked this far. Heaven only knows what happened to them after that.
Yes, those were the last traces of the missing airmen. Now, it has been suggested that they were carried off by hostile Bedouins, who carefully brushed away their trail. But such an explanation is inadequate, in view of the fact that a search was carried on by planes and armored cars and tribal patrols for 4 days and nights, and no renewal of the trail was ever found. Where they had gone remains the secret of the desert, a secret incredible but true.
It is not remarkable that so many of the reported ghosts and phantoms and supernatural visions have been observed just as night was falling, for that is a time when the mind is fatigued and is most subject to hallucinations. And yet, there are some, like that which Captain Nolan saw on the plains of Normandy, which cannot be so easily explained away.
It was during the latter days of the First World War. The cavalry troops under the command of Captain David Nolan had rendered valuable service in a score of crucial battles. They had been under fire for weeks on end, and now they were retiring behind the lines for a rest they had fully earned. The long column of horsemen moved slowly, wearily through the twilight. At their head rode Captain Nolan and 2 other officers. They were discussing how they intended to spend their leave.
You men can celebrate all you like. The only thing I want to do is to sleep.
Each man to his own taste, Digby. Mine happened to run toward wine, women, and song.
That sounds much more attractive to me. In the state I'm in, I couldn't even think of... Good Lord.
Captain Nolan broke off abruptly in the middle of the sentence. For it was just at that moment that he saw the phantom horsemen. They were clad in white, on white steeds, and they rode in a straight, silent column, paralleling the line of the captain's own men, not more than a dozen yards away. So swiftly did they move, and so soundlessly, that their horses' hooves seemed scarcely to be touching the ground. And the column did not end. It went on and on, one ghostly figure following another through the gathering dusk. Captain Nolan's first impulse was to turn to his fellow officers to call their attention to the amazing vision. But then he thought better of it, so he rode on in silence. For some reason, the men beside him had grown silent too. But a few moments later, while the captain's eyes were still fastened on the incredible cavalcade, Lieutenant Digby said suddenly,
"You may have something there after all, Captain. I could stand a good night's rest myself."
Nolan turned sharply and peered into Digby's face, as though he was seeking something there.
What made you change your mind?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose I'm more tired than I thought.
It seemed to hit you rather abruptly.
Yes, it did, didn't it, Captain?
And that was all the lieutenant would say. And once again, silence fell among the three men. But this time, it was short-lived. For after another moment or so, Lieutenant Wayne blurted out violently, almost hysterically,
I can't stand this any longer. You see them, so does Digby. We're not dreaming, and we're not just tired either. That column of cavalrymen is really there. If it weren't, why should all three of us be watching it?
yes, each of the three officers had seen the column at the same moment, and each had remained silent for fear of making himself look ridiculous. Night descended swiftly now, and the phantom horsemen were blotted from view. But at the next town, Captain Nolan sent back a searching party. They returned with the inevitable answer. No other cavalry troops were in the vicinity. None could have been. And yet, afterward, Captain Nolan and Lieutenants Digby and Wayne, all men of unquestionable integrity, were willing to swear that they had seen the same identical vision. A vision incredible but true.
In the little town of Neston in Cheshire, England, Teresa Higginson is well remembered, for it was she who had an experience so remarkable that it has made her name immortal among her fellow townsmen.
Father Donahue, the priest of Neston's church, was called away to London at least 4 times a year. So Teresa Higginson's title was more than honorary. Hers was the responsibility of seeing to it that the Holy Church remained inviolate. Consequently, she was rather startled when Father Donahue summoned her to him and inquired,
When I'm in London, Teresa, whom do you permit to enter the church?
Why, nobody, Father, nobody at all.
That is what I was afraid of. There are certain persons who should not be kept out of the church if they wish to enter it. There's Father Mooney of Wickham. If perchance he should come while I'm away, it's quite possible that he might wish to go in for a while and say Mass.
It was just 3 weeks later that Father Donahue departed for London. Neston's church rested on a rather high hill at the very outskirts of town. A gravel path ran from the road up to its doors, and it was there that Teresa Higginson met the strange priest.
He must be Father Mooney of Wickham. Good morning to you, Father Mooney.
But the man did not reply. Instead, he pointed a bony finger at the keys that were tightly clutched in Teresa's hand, and then he pointed the same finger at the door of the church.
He must want to go in.
The man was obviously familiar with the layout of the building. He made his way unhesitatingly into the sacristy.
Well, he must be Father Mooney. Who else would know his way around here?
It was not until after the ceremony had ended and the priest had returned to the sacristy to dispose of his vestments that she began to wonder again. For time passed. 10 minutes, 15, a half hour, and he did not reappear. At length, she stepped into the small, gloomy room. The vestments were there, but the man who had worn them had vanished.
But he couldn't have. There's only one door to this room, and I was standing outside of it the whole time.
On the evening of the following day, Father Donahue returned from his visit to London.
Why didn't you tell me he was such a queer one, Father?
Who, my dear?
This Father Mooney. He was here while you were gone.
But that's impossible, Teresa. Father Mooney was in London.
Well, then who did I see here? Who did I let into the church? Oh, he was a priest, all right. But I never saw such a strange-looking one. And An old man he was, and all bent over with a horrible humpback.
You say he was hunchbacked?
Aye, that he was.
And he was an old man?
Aye. Why'd you ask, Father?
Because there was a priest here once. He was an old man and a hunchback.
No wonder he knew the place inside and out. But what's his name, do you know?
His name was Father Keller. He's been dead for 50 years. His body is buried in the graveyard behind the church.
There were those, of course, in Neston who said that Teresa Higginson either lied or else she dreamed the whole affair. But there were others, and they included most of the townspeople who knew Teresa too well to do anything but accept her word. They simply accepted the incident as an incident incredible but true.
The poltergeist, or playful spirit, has been for centuries a familiar figure in the literature of psychical research. No one has ever seen him. No one has ever proved that he really exists. And while sophisticated minds of the 20th century may scoff at the idea of an invisible imp who maliciously moves furniture and shatters crockery, there are literally thousands of cases of such spontaneous physical phenomena which cannot be otherwise explained. There is, for example, the case of Mr. Playfair, the miller of Kent.
J.C. Playfair, owner of the furnace mill at Lamhurst, Kent, was a solid and practical man. Hence, when the hired man informed him, on a certain May morning in the year 1906, that a mysterious visitor had entered the stables during the night, Mr. Playfair was slightly annoyed.
How could anyone get in the stables? Every door's locked and bolted, and you and I have the only keys.
He didn't need a key, sir. It was one of the playful spirits. Some folks call him the poltergeist.
Oh, for heaven's sake, Cobley. How many times have I told you there are no...
I know, sir. But just the same, sir, I wish you'd come out to the stables and look for yourself.
And so Mr. Playfair, mumbling his disgust over the whole silly business, followed his hired hand out to the stables.
Good Lord. Look at the horses. They've all been turned around in their stalls.
Aye, sir.
And the mare, she's gone.
Aye, sir.
Cobley, you've done this yourself. There isn't room to turn those horses around like that. They'd have to be led out of the stalls and led back in again through this door. And the door was bolted.
I know, sir. But I haven't so much as touched them.
Now, here's my mare. She couldn't possibly have got out. This is ridiculous, Cobley. The whole thing's perfect.
Listen, sir.
Great Scott! What is it?
The barrel of lime, sir, up in the loft. He pushed it downstairs. The spirit's still in here.
Spirit nothing. Nobody but a man could have moved that barrel. You up there! Come down! Come down, I say, or I'll come up and get you!
But no one came down. And when Mr. Playfair, stepping over the lime barrel at the foot of the stairs, climbed up to the loft, he found it quite empty. He was on his way back to the ground floor again, when suddenly...
The water butt, sir, standing right there in the corner. He just turned it over.
The water butt? Good Lord, man. You and I together wouldn't have the strength to budge it.
Well, he did, sir, and that means he's right here in the room with us, and that means I'm getting out.
Cobley, wait a moment, come back. We're not leaving here till we've found my mare.
The A room is the only place left, and she couldn't very well be in there. Now, could she?
The hay room was a tiny space adjoining the stable, and the doorway to it was scarcely wide enough for a man, much less a horse, to squeeze through. Nevertheless, Mr. Playfair, having no place else to look, and ready by now to believe almost anything, did pull open the door and squint into the gloomy, malodorous room.
Cobley, look! She is in here. Now, how on earth could she have gotten through this narrow little door?
Of course, any sensible and civilized person of the 20th century knows that there are no such creatures as poltergeists. And yet, the miller's horses were turned about in their stalls, and the lime barrel and the water butt were upset, and it was necessary to remove a partition to get the mare out of the hay room. And though we may dismiss, with a superior smile, the idea of a playful spirit, these remain facts. Facts incredible, but true.
The floor of the ocean has always been associated with strange legends and fantastic creatures. Most of these are, of course, mythical figures, but there is on record in a serious and scientific publication of the Danish Meteorological Society a description of a form so incredible that it staggers the imagination of man, a form which actually exists and was actually observed.
The steamship Bintang was a merchant vessel belonging to the Danish East Asiatic Company. At 3 o'clock on the morning of June 10th, 1909, it was plowing its way through the calm waters of the Straits of Malacca. At 3:15, Captain Gabe, who had retired several hours before, was awakened from a sound sleep. One of the crew was pounding violently at his door.
What is it? Captain, open the door, sir. Hurry!
What is it, man? Good Lord, what's happened?
By the dim rays of the lantern, the captain could see the expression on the sailor's face. He could see the pallor of his cheeks and the stark terror in his eyes.
Well, answer me, man. What's happened?
You'd better come up and see for yourself. It's a wheel, sir, on the water. Or I should say in it. And it is coming toward us. And if one spoke of it even so much as touches us, we will be smashed in 1,000 pieces.
On deck, Captain Gabe found the entire crew huddled at the rail on the starboard side. They were silent and motionless, frozen with fear. And then he clutched the arm of the sailor beside him and gasped,
What in the name of heaven is that thing?
As far as the eye could reach, the sea was illuminated by a great wheel of light that revolved slowly just beneath the surface of the water. The fiery center of the wheel, though far out, was clearly visible. From it extended the spokes to which the sailor had referred, arms so long that they stretched beyond the horizon on one side and came within 30 yards of the boat on the other. And as they turned on their axis, they moved closer and closer to the ship's keel.
It's an optical illusion, men. There's no wheel out there at all. It must be the reflection of our own light.
But I never heard of a reflection stretching clear to the horizon. And I never saw one moving at a different speed and in a different direction from the thing that's being reflected.
Well, that's true. Perhaps another ship somewhere.
But the lookouts reported 5 minutes ago that there ain't another ship around, sir.
The captain and the crew stood staring at the monstrous mechanism, waiting for it to strike. And then, slowly, the light of the wheel grew dimmer, and the whole apparatus seemed gradually to sink deeper into the water. The ship glided smoothly and safely over the spot where it had been, and nothing remained as evidence that it had ever been seen. The submarine voyager, some have suggested, a visitor from space, has been the opinion of others, while most have simply accepted it as one of the many insoluble mysteries of the sea. A mystery. Incredible, but true.
So permeated with mysticism are the writings of Pierre Loti, the great French romanticist, that it comes as no surprise to us to learn that in the latter days of his life, his name was connected with a haunting mystery that has never been and perhaps will never be explained.
Dear to Pierre Loti's heart was his Oriental art collection. Of all the pieces which he had acquired through the years, the one that pleased him most was the one that he himself had created. It was a mosque, a beautiful, gleaming, domed reproduction of a Mohammedan place of worship. Though it was, of course, in miniature, it filled the greater part of the room in which it stood, and was high enough to permit a full-grown man to stand upright in it. When, after months of painstaking labor, the mosque was completed, Monsieur Loti invited his friend, Monsieur Courteline, to observe it.
A magnificent piece of work. The thing has an air about it, Pierre. An air of Eastern mystery. As if it held all the secrets that we poor Occidentals will never understand.
You are very kind, mon ami.
I'm not trying to be kind. I'm simply telling you what...
Wait a moment. What was that?
Sounded like... Listen. Mon Dieu. Pierre, it came from inside the mosque.
Yes, as if there was something in there trying to get out.
There it is again. Come on, let's see what it is.
The two men eased themselves to the narrow entrance. They stood in the gloomy semi-darkness of the mosque's interior. It was empty, of course.
It must have been a mouse, Pierre.
It couldn't have been anything else, could it?
From that day on, Pierre Loti took great care to guard his precious structure. The door to the room was always locked, and he alone had the key. During the weeks that followed, he spent many hours with his art collection. And every now and then, suddenly, without warning, it would come. Always the same number of raps. Always from inside the mosque. The first few times, Pierre Loti investigated. And then, later, he merely sat and listened and wondered. But one night, he chanced to fall asleep in the room. He was awakened shortly before midnight by the same mysterious sound. He arose from his chair and stepped inside the mosque.
Mon Dieu. No, it isn't possible.
In an instant, Pierre was at the telephone calling his friend Courteline. A half hour later, the two men stood inside the mosque. It was brightened by the rays of a flashlight in Pierre Loti's hand.
There, on the floor, what do you see? Footprints. The footprints of young children.
Yes, clearly visible in the dust on the floor of the mosque were the impressions of children's naked feet. And yet there were no children in Pierre Loti's home. And none came to visit him. Nor was this the only time the prints were observed. No matter how often he wiped them away, they continued to reappear. Was it true, as Courteline had suggested, that the mosque held oriental secrets which no Western mind could ever fathom? If not, then what is the explanation of this baffling riddle? A riddle incredible but true.
One of the most baffling of all scientific phenomena is the phenomenon known as stigmatization. And in spite of our inability to explain it, that it has occurred even in contemporary times can hardly be disputed.
More than 7 centuries have passed since St. Francis of Assisi, known during his lifetime merely as Brother Francis, went into the Apennine Mountains and with his disciples climbed Mount Alverno. There in a rude cell he fasted and prayed for 40 days and nights. The 40th day was September 14th, 1224, and it was the day the vision came to him. The vision of a winged seraph nailed to a cross. He invited his disciples into his cell to witness it. And one of them, looking down at him, cried,
This is no vision, Brother Francis. This is no dream. This is a miracle. A miracle of God.
725 years is a long time. It is sufficient time for facts to be twisted and for legends to grow. But there is the written word of Pope Alexander IV that he saw evidence of the miracle with his own eyes. There is the testimony of those later men and women who underwent the same mystical experience. Benedict Reggio of Bologna, and John Gray and Nicholas of Ravenna, and Anna Katharina Emmerich, the peasant girl of Munster. And if anyone still remains skeptical, then we must refer him to the newspapers of July 10th, 1922. For the miracle of St. Francis is not confined to the misty past. It happened again to an ordinary young girl named Mary Riley in the ordinary American town of Peekskill, New York. There, at the home of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, Mary Riley awoke from a deep sleep and, feeling a sharp pain at her side, glanced down.
Mother, it has happened to me. It was there when I awoke, Mother. I had a strange dream, and then my side hurt me, and that awakened me. And it was there. A cross of blood. Yes. Just like St. Francis, isn't it, Mother?
The wounds of Christ appeared on him. On you it is a cross of blood. But there can be no question it is the same thing. The same miracle of God.
This is the phenomenon of stigmatization, the appearance on the body of wounds, either in the form of the cross or in the pattern of Christ's own wounds. Sometimes it has occurred during a cataleptic condition, sometimes only during a heavy sleep. But that it has occurred cannot be doubted, nor has its cause ever been satisfactorily explained. As far as our knowledge goes, it remains what it was in the days of St. Francis. A miracle. A miracle incredible but true.
The work of the great Dr. Sigmund Freud centered the attention of the whole scientific world on the subject of dreams. It is not surprising, therefore, that one of Freud's fellow psychologists, Dr. Ignaz Jesauers, should have made a hobby of collecting and recording strange dreams which were imparted to him during his years of practice in Old Vienna. What is surprising, however, is that in the doctor's collection, there is at least one dream which no psychiatric theory can account for. A dream that defies the very premises of Freudianism itself.
The rain fell steadily on the streets of Amsterdam. Hendrik van der Moon, a member of the Amsterdam police force, drew the collar of his coat around his neck and shuddered as he lingered at the canal bridge, fascinated by the ripple of the raindrops in the water below him.
Mein Gott, a man in the water, and he is bound and gagged.
Early the following morning, in the little town of Lochel, Switzerland, one Gustav Mertz, who was both the police chief of Lochel and also its police force, read a telegram in the privacy of his office.
Identified him as Jacob Douwer, a watchmaker of your village. Was still alive when rescued from the Amsterdam Canal, but had been bound and gagged and severely beaten. Died without regaining consciousness. Obviously a victim of murder.
Later that morning, young Rudolf Bauer, son of the late Jacob Bauer, received a call from Police Chief Gustav Mertz.
My father? Dead?
Murdered, Rudolf. He went to Amsterdam on business, I suppose.
Yes. To buy materials.
He had enemies there?
Why, no. He scarcely knew anyone in Amsterdam.
And here in Lochel?
Well, no. Unless you would call Ulrich Tobler an enemy. He owed Father a good deal of money. He refused to pay him. It made Father very angry. At least it used to. A few weeks ago, Father stopped talking about it. It was almost as if for some reason, he was afraid of Ulrich Tobler.
It was not until 2 days later, when he was going through the deceased's personal papers, that Gustav Mertz found out why the watchmaker had grown afraid of his neighbor Ulrich Tobler. That was when he found the record of the dream. It was carefully written down in Jacob Bauer's neat, sturdy hand.
If I had had this dream only once, I would not bother to set it down. But it has come to me not once, nor twice, nor even
3 times. 4 times in all I have had it. In the dream, I was arguing with Ulrich Tobler. I reminded him of the money he owed me, and I told him he must pay. But he refused and laughed at me. And then I grew very angry, and I said I would sue him. A very evil look came into his eyes, and he turned away. I, too, turned away. And then, before I could take a step, something struck me on the back of the head. I fell to the ground, and the next thing I knew, I could see myself, bound and gagged and bleeding. Around me there was nothing but a cold, wet blackness, for I had been thrown unconscious into the waters of a canal.
Yes, this was the dream that Jacob Bauer had written down a few days before he died. Can such a dream be classified in the Freudian manner as the mere expression of a subconscious fear or desire? Must it not rather be accepted as a prophecy incredible but true?
Every human being, it is said, is part of the social fabric. And indeed, so obvious does this seem that if ever we should happen to hear of a man who was actually isolated, actually alone, we might well assume that he was a stranger among us, an intruder on the earth. Yet the case of at least one such man has been recorded.
He was lying in a plowed field when they found him. Gillum, the hired man, was the first to notice the body. It lay white and naked and terrible under the noonday sun.
A dead man lying out in the field. He's naked as the day he was born. I never seen him in these parts before. You'd better come out and have a look, sir.
The owner of the farm, having examined the corpse carefully, announced that he had never seen him before either. And so the Petersfield police were called in. And the local inspector decided that identification should not be too difficult.
It's simply a matter of finding the chap's clothes, that's all. He must have been wearing them when he came out here. There are no fresh car tracks in the road, and he could scarcely have walked up from town naked without causing some comment. So the clothes must be around here somewhere.
But the clothes were not to be found. During the search, however, the hired man made one important discovery.
Footprints, Inspector. They've been made by bare feet, if you noticed. So they must be his.
And so they followed the stranger's footprints. They followed them through the road a half-mile away, and across the road and into the field on the other side. There the footprints stopped.
Why, it's almost as if the bloke came from another planet. Just dropped down out of the heavens, he did, and died.
But the inspector, who was a practical man, chose to ignore Mr. Gillum's fantastic suggestion. It might prove a little more difficult than he had thought at first, but in the end, the body would be identified. At the inquest, the coroner reported that there were
no wounds on the deceased. There were neither drugs nor poison in the contents of his stomach. He was obviously not the victim of foul play. His death was due simply to exposure.
Exposure? How could he have died of exposure? He could see the house from where he was. All he'd have had to do was knock on the door and walk in.
What the gentleman says may be quite true. Nevertheless, death was due to exposure. To continue, the man was between 35 and 40 years of age. He was not a manual worker. His hands and nails indicate that. He was well nourished and, I should say, well educated. A man of considerable substance. It should certainly not be difficult to learn the identity of such a person.
The efforts that were exerted during the week that followed were more than adequate. A photograph of the man, together with a description of him, was published in practically every paper throughout England. 2 months later, on April 16th, the London Daily News reported that the police were still without a clue, that there was no record of any missing person bearing the slightest resemblance to this man. If most Englishmen were puzzled by the affair, Mr. Gillum, the hired man, was not.
They're wasting their time with their photographs and whatnot, I tell you. The bloke was a stranger. And not just here in Hampshire either. He was a stranger on the earth. They'll never find anyone who ever knew him.
Today, the identity of the dead man still remains a mystery. The incident takes its rightful place in the annals of amazing stories. Stories incredible but true.
So close are the ties of blood, we are rarely surprised when we hear of a man or a woman who has been saved from death by the courage and self-sacrifice of another member of the family. But when a double rescue takes place, and when the parties to it are thousands of miles apart, and neither one even aware of his role in it, then it is an incident which belongs in the chronicles of the strange and the incredible.
It was in the winter of 1940. The British submarine C-23 was at rest far beneath the surface of the water. And in his bunk, Officer Ian Scott lay fast asleep, dreaming. Somehow, he found himself in a munitions plant in London. In the room before him, a young girl was hard at work.
Why, it's Nell. It's my sister, Nell.
Scott came quickly up behind her, but then suddenly he stopped. The girl was no longer working. She was asleep, her head on the table. Near her, a thin tongue of flame was creeping closer and closer.
Good Lord. Fire. Nell, wake up. The plant's on fire.
In desperation, Scott seized her arm and shook it violently, and she raised her head. But just at that moment... Officer Scott awoke, the sound of the explosion still crashing in his ears. And now, as his mind cleared, he became aware of the air around him.
Petrol fumes. The whole submarine's filled with them. We've got to get to the surface or we're lost.
Around him, other members of the crew were lying in their bunks sleeping. As a result of the fumes, some had already slipped into a deep coma. But by shouting and shaking and stabbing, Officer Scott managed to arouse 3 of them, and, working with maniacal speed, they brought the vessel to the surface, to the fresh, sweet, life-giving air.
You know, you chaps ought to be grateful to my sister Nell. If I hadn't dreamed about her, and if that explosion in my dream hadn't awakened me when it did, the whole lot of us would have been dead pigeons. You really ought to thank her.
It was another 2 months before Officer Scott did get home on leave. And among those who greeted him with greatest warmth was his sister Nell. For, as she said, not only was she glad to see him, but she had a very special reason to be grateful to him.
Grateful? What did I do?
Just saved my life, that's all. It was about 2 months ago. I was working at the plant. I got so sleepy I couldn't hold my head up. I left my table, I went to the restroom and fell asleep. And I dreamed about you. You were lying in a submarine, and you looked as if you were dead. But you weren't really dead at all.
I was in a coma, perhaps?
Perhaps. Anyway, I tried to wake you, and I couldn't. And then there was a terrific explosion.
In your dream?
No, it was in the plant. I woke up and I found out that the whole filling shop where I work, that it had been blown sky high. 36 women were killed. I'd have been one of them if I'd been working.
After that, he and Scott told his sister of his own dream, of the role she had played in saving his life. And then the two of them stared at each other in blank amazement. For what theory can be offered to explain this remarkable coincidence? The mere fact that it occurred leads us to realize how scanty is the scientific knowledge which would make comprehensible stories such as this. Stories incredible but true.